Good morning, everybody. Welcome to New Hampshire Business Review's webinar, The Negative Impact of the Pandemic on Women in the Workforce. And thank you for joining us. We have a really important topic to discuss today. I'm grateful both to the speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, but also to our sponsors, Sheehan Phinney, United Healthcare, Tufts Health Freedom Plan. We're grateful to them for allowing us or giving us the resources we need to produce this discussion today. McKinsey Company last fall in their 6th annual Women in the Workplace study said this: in a year marked by crisis and uncertainty, corporate America is at a crossroads. The choices companies make today will have consequences on gender equality for decades to come. And I think that's all I'm going to say on this powerful statement, because we have speakers here who will say it much more eloquently. And I'd like to introduce them to you now. Our panelists today are the Honorable Melanie Levesque, a board member of the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, Caitlin McCormick, Director of Account Management at United Healthcare, and Karen Whitley, attorney at Sheehan Phinney. Welcome all of you, and we're gonna, the pattern for today's discussion is going to be each one of our presenters is going to give you some insights individually, and then we'll all get together for a question and answer session afterwards. Please remember that when we get to the question and answer session, there is a question tool in the GoToWebinar panel. After a year of you all being on webinars, I feel like I hardly have to say that anymore, but it's there just for that one person who hasn't been on a webinar yet since last March. But please do ask questions, and we will get to them as we get into the Q&A session. And so I'd like to welcome Melanie Levesque first. Melanie.
Good morning, Ernesto, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we talk about this very important topic, the impact of COVID-19 on New Hampshire women. My name is Melanie Levesque. I am a board member of the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, as well as a former state senator and a small business owner. And next slide. At the Women's Foundation, what we're focusing on is investing in opportunities and equality for women and girls in the Granite State. We do this through research, education, advocacy, grant making, and philanthropy. We're going through the grant making process right now, and a few of the programs that we have are Women Run, to help women candidates run for office. We have community grants, of which we've given out quite a few each year. The Gender Justice Cafe series, we have a series coming up on climate and gender justice on May 4th, as well as our annual statewide gala, which is recognizing women who have assisted and helped out with the impact of COVID, and that's going to be May 21st. And we also have women building community luncheon events. And next slide. Some of the research that we're doing are, first of all, the status of women in New Hampshire. We also will be coming out with the status of girls in New Hampshire later on this year. We've also published something called Gender Matters, and this is focused this year on municipal town governments and the makeup of women to men and their equality there within the municipal government. In addition to our Gender Matters research we've done on COVID-19. So this is very applicable. And again, I'm very glad to be here to share this information with you. Next slide. So from our research, we have found that the essential workers are most impacted by COVID, as you've heard, but what we found is that women comprise up 2/3 of the essential workforce. So that's a great deal. And these women have roles in childcare and social services, in healthcare, grocery retail and convenience stores, building and cleaning services, public transit, and trucking and warehouse roles. So they are significantly impacted. And these women hold the majority of jobs in the childcare, social services, and healthcare industries. And these are the industries that were hit hardest by COVID. Next slide. Some of the national trends in the workforce. An article from fortune.com speaks of how all the jobs in the US workforce lost in the month of December, 100% of them belong to women. Another very impactful article from 19thnews.com spoke about how 865,000 women left the workforce in September. Actually, there were 661,000 new jobs that were added, yet 865,000 women left the workforce. In the New York Times.com, an article called "The Pandemic Could Scare a Generation of Working Mothers," or excuse me, scar, not scare. This is a really, my apologies, this is a really impactful article, and I would certainly recommend to everyone to read that article. But it really touches on the long-term impacts of leaving the workforce and how difficult it would be to regain and re-enter the workforce. The next slide. Another issue is the wage gap. There is a wage gap within as we compare women to men and their earnings. As we look at the healthcare wage gap, 76% of the women are in roles of healthcare practitioner and technical occupations, and they make 71.4 cents on the dollar. For healthcare support occupations, 89.5% of women comprise those roles, and they make 79.1 cents on the dollar. So that is a large discrepancy compared to what men make. Women who are making less wages find themselves financially vulnerable. In cases where they may have to come up with funds for emergency reasons, they would not have these funds. And that vulnerability is even greatly impacted by COVID and this economic downturn. Next slide, please. Equal Pay Day. Many of you may have heard of this, but there is a day that women actually make 100% of what men make, and that's called Equal Pay Day. But currently, women still make about 82 cents on the dollar compared to white men. Women of color don't start marking Equal Pay Day until well into the summer. Actually, it's August 19th. Black women earn 63 cents on the dollar. American Indian and Alaska Native women earn 60 cents, and Latinas earn 55 cents compared to their white male counterparts. Now, Asian American and Pacific Islander women earn 85 cents on the dollar. We still have a long way to go with pay equity for women, and at this current rate, it would take up to 2059 before women reach parity with men. Next slide. Childcare is a very important area where women are more greatly impacted. If you look at this diagram, we can see that the number of people citing childcare as the primary reason for leaving the workforce has certainly grown from April to August and October of 2020. And the blue line that we see here are the percentage of women throughout the US. The red line is a percentage of women that are in New Hampshire. Women are taking on the majority of the roles of childcare and education and household tasks. And the lack of childcare has been a rising factor in reported reasons for leaving the workforce, as I just mentioned. And there are ways that we can overcome this, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about shortly. And next slide. Some of the conclusions are that without intervention to address this impact of COVID and the disproportionate impact on women, women's progress will continue to decline. And this is not just a setback that causes gender equality, but it's also going to hold back our state's economic recovery and deny women and their families an equitable share of future opportunities and prosperity. And I just want to stress how this impacts our state's economy. When people have money in their pockets, when they're making a good wage, they then invest that into the economy. They spend money on goods and services. So having pay equity is a critical point for women to achieve that economy, and it's very critical for our environment and for our economic recovery. Next slide. Okay, some of the action items that we have action items that are happening at the federal and state level, and they're focusing more on the long-term efforts. There's also a need to center these investments on those that are most impacted by COVID-19. So some of the solutions that we are recommending are paid leave, and we've seen many companies adopt paid family medical leave, but also equal pay. As we said earlier, by 2059, women will be on parity as men. And that's a long time to wait, and it's a time that families will suffer. Also, access to childcare. Access to childcare and flexibility of hours would allow women to regain or re-enter the workforce. And you know, these three are very critical elements that we advocate for at the Women's Foundation. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie. And next, we are going to bring up Caitlin. And again, if you have questions, as I certainly did after, or things that to follow up on the thought-provoking ideas that Melanie presented, do put them in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of all of the presentations. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Ernesto. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Melanie, for that great information. I'm going to continue along some of those same lines that Melanie just discussed. So, Ernesto, if you could go to the next slide. Just by way of introduction about me, my name is Caitlin McCormick. I'm the Director of Account Management for United Healthcare. And most notably in New Hampshire, we were very fortunate to welcome the Tufts Freedom Plan into our United Healthcare family this past January. So we are expanding our footprint in the New Hampshire market, and so very much looking forward to working with many of you here on the line. Ernesto, if you could go to the next screen, the next slide rather. Thank you. So some of these statistics will look familiar and along the same lines of what Melanie just discussed, but the problem here is real. 2.3 million women exited the labor force by early 2021. We see the rate of the women's labor force participation being at 57%, which is the lowest rate since 1988. So certainly, you know, cause for pause and concern as we think about the future of women in the workforce and the interventions that we as employers can look to take sooner rather than later. What's more staggering is that the unemployment rate for women in 2020 was 2 times what it was in 2019. And obviously the pandemic played a huge role on that. But as we look at coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and next steps in the workforce, we really have to be mindful of how we support women and get them back into the workforce at a much higher rate. Those unemployment rates are especially high for women of color. So if we look at the January 2021 stats here on the right, nearly 8% of Asian women are unemployed, 8.5% of Black women, and 8.8% of Hispanic women. So when you think about women of color, you know, the problem is even larger than it is for some of their counterparts. And then I think what's really staggering here at the bottom right-hand corner of this page is that employment for women may not recover to pre-pandemic levels until 2024. That's a long time, right? 3 years from now, and it's 2 full years after what we expect to see for men, which is that, you know, their employment levels would recover by sometime next year. So, you know, certainly something that we need to think about, and where we need to have this call for action for employers to do better in this space. Next slide, please, Ernesto. When it comes to women in leadership, the problem only compounds. So, you know, 70% of businesses don't consider gender equity a top priority. 25% of organizations make advancement of women a top 10 priority. You know, we'd love to see that be a much higher number. And 56% of employees feel like their organization has a do-it-when-they-can approach to gender equity rather than really making it a priority. If you look at the leadership positions that were held by women in 2019, you can see here on the right-hand side in this chart that at every level, at the senior manager level, at the vice president level, at the senior vice president level, we've seen, you know, decreases to numbers that were already too low to begin with. So when we think about, you know, re-employing women and getting women back into the workforce, we also have to think about what positions we're making available to them and what are the benefits that we can give to them to support them and really make it possible for them to hold these leadership and senior leadership positions within organizations. Next slide, please, Ernesto. So when we think about motherhood, right, work in the pandemic, you know, I am the mother of a 2-year-old, and certainly this year has been challenging for many in terms of trying to figure out childcare, and a lot of the support systems that mothers had prior to the pandemic really went away. Things, you know, childcare situations have changed. Being able to see family or grandparents has changed. And so it's no surprise that women have been forced to make really hard decisions over the last 12 months. Decisions between caring for their families and having a career. And for those of us like myself who are lucky enough to work from home, you know, there's a little bit less impact, but certainly still a lot of pressure on those moms who are struggling to make their life work in both aspects, motherhood and career-wise. So 80% of the people who exited the workforce were women when school resumed in September of 2020. So, you know, when you think about, you know, moms who had to quickly pivot to start providing education at home, you know, that was a big concern. 12% of all women who stopped working cited childcare as a reason while they had to stop working, as compared to only 1% of men. And then the burnout is real. I'm going to talk in a little while about the mental health impact, but certainly, you know, there really has been no break for parents and specifically for mothers during this time, right? There's not the ability to get out of your house and sort of refresh and take a vacation. And so that burnout between working and motherhood has really been profound. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about women's well-being in the pandemic. We have spent a lot of time, you know, looking at claim data over the last year and looking at people's health in general. And so when you think about, you know, women's well-being, you can see here on the left-hand side, the women are the blue bars and men are the yellow. And certainly there's been an impact on the whole population, right? I mean, you can see both women and men have felt very stressed, have felt like this has worsened things for them in the workplace, or that their life has changed a great deal. But you can see that proportionally, those numbers are higher for women. 43% of women reported their overall well-being was worse. You know, things like not having time for self-care, or you know, even just being able to take care of basic health needs has contributed to that. 57% of women were likely to report COVID-19 related work or life changes, like we talked about on the prior slide, and 44% were more likely to report their financial well-being being worse. And that really speaks to the pay equity that Melanie spoke about, as well as the unemployment rate. Next slide, please. So when we think about COVID-19, specifically around mental health, I heard someone on our team speak a couple of weeks ago who was saying, pretty much everyone in this country needs some form of mental health care at this point. And that could be something as simple as an app, a meditation app, some way to relieve stress, all the way up to, in-person counseling or inpatient treatment. This has certainly been a very stressful year and has caused people to experience a lot of trauma, a lot of grief, a lot of anxiety. And we really think that these psychological consequences may extend for months, if not years, after the pandemic is over. And the correlation between the economic security and people's emotional health is real. The impact of loneliness, you can see here on the screen, is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So when you think about your overall health and people being disconnected from others, it really does take a toll not only on their mental state, but on their physical well-being. And then, of course, if you think about people who are victims of domestic violence, and a lot of those people are women, the stress of the pandemic has made that abuse even worse, and in many cases has eliminated their ability to get out of that situation. So certainly something that as employers, we can be mindful of and provide benefits to people, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, that can help them to get their mental health back on track and to recover from this event that's been so impactful to so many. Next slide, please. One good thing that we have seen come out of the pandemic is the rise of telehealth use. So there's been a 20-time increase in telehealth visits in 2020 as compared to 2019. So pre-pandemic, we would often talk to clients who had been offering, virtual visits or telehealth benefits and tell them, 2, 3, 4% of their population were using them. And now, we see that has just increased so substantially. And that's something we expect to continue post-pandemic, and something that I think is a real positive for women. If you think about a busy lifestyle, bringing your kids to visits, driving here and there, certainly for types of care that are appropriate in a telehealth setting, this is not only a convenience, but helps women, continue to get the care that they need. 61% of telehealth visits in 2020 were women, as compared to almost 40% that were men. So we see about a 22% increase in women going for telehealth visits over men, which is great. And then, so this is something that we do really expect to see continue. And the feedback that we have heard, you can see 63% of patients who have seen a doctor virtually report no difference in the quality of the visit. So this is a real positive that's come out of COVID, and one that I think we'll see continue to be a trend. Next slide, please. This just furthers what I just mentioned around telehealth. So, 2% of claims pre-pandemic were virtual care. Now, post-pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic still, but sort of post this outcome, we see over 60% of claims being virtual care. So members are really much more aware of them. Members are more likely to use a virtual visit now or in the future, which is up from 55% pre-COVID. The benefits, especially around virtual behavioral health care, are significant. So we see people, being able to adhere to behavioral health visits that maybe they need to see a therapist or a counselor weekly. That before, that would have been really difficult for them to get there, to drive there, to sit in traffic, all of those things. And now, they're able to do that appointment from anywhere, which allows them to not have time away from the office, not have time away from their family. And obviously, in the current scenario where we're still facing the pandemic, those virtual visits are really reducing exposure to COVID-19 as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to wrap up by talking about, we often hear, well, what is United Healthcare doing for their employees and for their members as employers think about ideas for benefits they might want to offer within their own population. So this is a snapshot of what United Healthcare has done for its team during this time. So we paid our workforce in full and didn't require team members who were diagnosed with COVID-19 to take paid time off. We covered all COVID-19 costs fully with no cost sharing. So this has really enabled parents, if they are diagnosed, not to have to use their paid time off because of a COVID situation. We've increased compensation for our frontline clinical workforce. We've rolled out a United Cares program, which is a high touch support program for team members or family members who have a COVID-19 diagnosis. We've also offered emergency backup childcare. I think that has been one of the benefits that this pandemic has really reminded us the importance of. So when people's childcare shuts down, they have to find a reasonable backup. And so giving employees the means by which to do that has been really important. We've had people working from home. We transitioned about 90% of our non-clinical workforce to work from home, which allowed them to continue working, but also, making the decisions they needed to make for their family. And Ernesto, if you go to the final page, this is just a little bit about what we've done for our members and things that, you as employers may want to think about, continuing to waive cost sharing for COVID-19 diagnosis and treatment, providing unlimited telehealth visits at no cost, and expanding access to virtual visits, especially in the behavioral health space. Thinking about assistance you can provide for socially isolated members, coordinating access to medication or food, and then thinking about things like, how can people check their symptoms? How can people have access to providers when they're not going into an office-based setting? So I think there are things we can all do to think about, our overall workforce and specifically women in the workforce, because the numbers that we discussed today are really staggering. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how we're going to change that trajectory and make sure that it's not 2024 before, women in the workforce really recovers to pre-pandemic levels. So with that, Ernesto, I'll turn things back over to you. Thank you very much.
Caitlin, thank you. That was great. And I do want to, we're about to bring Karen up. I want to just take 1 second and mention, Caitlin, you had called on me to advance the slides, and I want to acknowledge that actually our producer, Emily Samadas, has been advancing the slides and doing everything else that's important in terms of pulling this program together and all of the programs together. She is the marketing manager and events manager here at McLean Communications and New Hampshire Business Review. So thank you, Emily. Karen, nice to see you. Take it away.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Whitley. I'm a shareholder at Sheehan, Phinney, where I am a member of our labor and employment practice group. And I have, over the past year, been helping employers navigate all the difficult changes in their workforce and in the laws that impact their workforce as a result of COVID. And I'm also a member of the Boston Club in Massachusetts, which is focused on advancing women leaders. So this is a cry that is near and dear to what I do. So next slide, please. And I want to thank Melanie and Caitlin for the very sobering statistics that they have offered this morning. And what I would like to do is just give an overview of some of the laws and employer policies that have been helping and could help in the future, because the negative impact really is clear. And as has been said, it's likely to be long lasting. And the causes are pretty clear as well. But not everything we're seeing is new. And some of these things have been around for a while, and as I'll talk about. But what I would really like to give you some groundwork in is how employers might be able to respond. Next slide, please. So caregiver, the status of being a caregiver is not a protected category under state or federal law. But statistics show that women are primarily the caregivers in many family situations. So if an employer is taking action because somebody can't be at work because they're a caregiver, that very well could be discrimination on the basis of either their gender, or if they're taking care of somebody who has a disability and maybe is vulnerable to COVID, that could also be discrimination on the basis of a disability. So this has been around, as I mentioned, for a while. And even way back in 2007 and 2009, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission started focusing on caregiver discrimination and published 2 guides that are still pertinent today. I went through the best practices, one that's listed here from 2009, and realized how little has changed and how many great ideas were included in that for employers to look to and say, how can we help our caregiver employees? So those are 2 guides that that could be very helpful for employers who are looking to understand the issues and also come up with some practical solutions. Next slide, please. So want to talk for a little bit about the pandemic era laws that are helping caregivers. In April of last year, or actually March of last year, it took effect on April 1st of last year, Congress, US Congress put in place the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA. And it was mandatory for most employers under 500 employees for the period April 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2020. And that offered up to 10 days at 2/3 pay to somebody who had to care for an ill child or someone who had been exposed to COVID or whose school or daycare was closed or unavailable due to COVID. And it also provided up to 12 weeks just for childcare reasons. The first 2 weeks were unpaid, so an employee could substitute those 10 sick days for those first 2 weeks. But after that, it was up to 10 additional weeks just to assist workers, paying them 2/3 of their pay, up to $200 a day, to care for a child whose school or daycare was closed. So that was a big assist to employees who had these caregiving responsibilities. And there's a non-retaliation provision. And it really, apart from the fact that it was difficult for employers potentially to manage the absence, it was not out of pocket for the employers because they got a tax credit for the amounts that they paid under the FFCRA to those employees. Next slide, please. So as I noted, it ended, that FFCRA, the mandatory part of it, ended on December 31st of 2020. And so the question became, what next? And it was through the late December stimulus package, it was decided that employers could voluntarily extend those same types of leave. So 10 sick days, if the employee hadn't used them up already, or the child care leave. And so that was extended voluntarily. If employers wanted to do that, they could, and they could take the tax credit. So that was only through March 31st. So in March 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act was passed and again extended to employers with 500 or fewer employees the ability to offer these type of sick leave and child care leave and take a tax credit through September 30th this year. Next slide. So if the employer does voluntarily offer FFCRA leave, they can take that tax credit for leave that an employee takes. The ARPA has expanded the reasons. So it used to be 10 days for paid sick leave and 12 weeks or 10 additional weeks for just that childcare leave. Now that expanded leave could be taken for other reasons. So that is an expansion that employers can take advantage of. So for employers looking to be supportive of caregivers in the workplace, there is this opportunity. And again, whatever they pay out to employees, they can recover that through a tax credit against their payroll taxes. I will also note that ARPA temporarily increased the annual limit on pre-tax contributions to the dependent care flexible spending accounts. So for a single or married person, it would be from $5,000 a year to $10,500. So that could again be an assist to employees who are caregivers and would like to put that as a pre-tax expense. Next slide, please. So there are a few more laws that were enacted in the past year that could help women stay in the workforce. There were a couple of laws, a couple of acts that gave employers certain credits or benefits for retaining their workforce. So for example, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, forgiveness is based in part on retaining a workforce. And the Employee Retention Tax Credit encourages employers to keep employees on their payroll with a refundable tax credit. So again, there have been some laws. I shudder to think what would have happened had these laws not been in place, to the numbers that we've seen about women leaving the workforce. But there have been some temporary efforts to sort of stop the flow and really have a support structure in place for women and other employees, but focused on women this morning. So next slide, please. But as I noted, they're only temporary. So what currently exists in New Hampshire specifically to help women stay in the workforce? A couple of years ago, 2016, 5 years ago at this point, New Hampshire did adopt the flexible work arrangement law, which basically says that employers don't have to give flexible work arrangements, don't have to agree if somebody asks for a flexible work arrangement, but that the employer cannot retaliate against anybody who asks for a flexible work schedule. So it's something, and it's something that I consistently add to the handbooks that I review so that employees know they can at least ask. Next slide, please. Now, nationally, there's the federal FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, which provides unpaid leave to people who are unable to work. And the FFCRA that I talked about earlier added a component of that to allow for this child care leave. But again, that will be over currently no later than September 30th of this year. The Family Medical Leave Act does exist federally and provides unpaid leave to people who have to take time off to care for somebody with a serious health condition. Currently, New Hampshire does not have a paid family leave or a paid sick time program. New Hampshire has considered or is considering laws of this type. New Hampshire doesn't have a sick leave law, for example, doesn't have paid leave law, but there are good models that exist in other states. As I mentioned, I am an attorney with Sheehan Phinney. We have offices in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and so I'm very familiar with what Massachusetts is doing. And there are opportunities for employers to look at those models, and even if it's not required in state law, provide some sick leave, either or both for employees who are sick themselves, but also who need to be available for preventive care reasons or to take care of ill family members. And those sick leave laws that, there are models in many other states, often also provide coverage for leave for victims of domestic violence. So they offer sick leave, which also can be taken if somebody needs to take time off to go find new housing due to domestic violence. Because agencies are reporting that abuse during the pandemic, it has significantly intensified. Next slide, please. And another thing that employers can do in their own internal policies and practices to help women stay in the workforce is to take a good look at their remote work policies. Everybody changed direction on a dime last March when things were shut down and people needed to start working from home. And I think some employers have developed some ad hoc practices, and maybe that's worked for them, and then they've called people back to work. And maybe some people have been reluctant to do that, and some people have come in, but some employers are still allowing people to work from home. And it is really important going forward to have a very strong remote work policy so that the expectations are clear. You want to have expectations about how is productivity going to be measured? How is accountability going to be measured? How do we make sure people are actually working? How do we make sure the people who are Zooming in are feeling included and belonging? How do we make sure that they have a path for advancing within an organization? And what can we do to make sure that the negative perceptions about people who work from home are minimized? You don't want to have a culture where people who work from home are seen as less committed, less reliable, less capable. Next slide, please. So just a couple of thoughts on how to make, to make remote work a reality. There were, the needs for people to be at home working, but also having their children working. Not everybody had the proper equipment to allow both for homeschooling and working from home. Maybe they didn't have the right Wi-Fi. Could there be some benefits that employers can offer to make sure that that is a reality? And looking at job descriptions is a key area here. Look at whether and why and when on-site or in-person work is an essential job function. Can some job duties that are non-essential, that it's not essential that you be in the workplace, could those be work from home? Are there opportunities to reassign people who need to work from home to either a job that can be done flexibly or remotely, or maybe delegate some of their responsibilities to somebody else for a period of time? But a big part of this also is manager training. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the negative perceptions, that can start at the top. And if somebody in a managerial role isn't appreciating the value that somebody who's working remotely or flexibly can bring to that team, that's not going to be sustainable. Next slide. So some other things that employers can do to offer support to employees is to take a good look at their handbook and what do their policies say, and what policies do they have, and could those policies be having an unintended impact on a pay or promotion or leave of absence or sick time perspective? Do they negatively impact women? Employers can also look at offering employee assistance programs, which can help with some of the issues that Caitlin was talking about in terms of, mental health and other work-life balance issues. And employers can also do an internal pay equity analysis. Massachusetts enacted a law a couple of years ago that actually requires employers to look at their own internal pay practices to ensure that there is no unlawful difference in what men and women are paid. New Hampshire does have an equal pay law, but it does not require that level of internal review, which could definitely benefit employees, female employees. And finally, HR can always ask, how can we help? And often employers will find that it's not a big fix that's needed, but if you talk to the employees, maybe it's something they can suggest that will allow them to stay in the workforce and have a win-win for the employees and the employers. Next slide, please. So there will be times when employees do need to leave, and there are things that employers can do to support them as they leave. One of the interesting issues that came up during COVID is the idea that some people could go out on unemployment, because New Hampshire did allow unemployment benefits for people who were unable to work due to schools being closed. So there is a benefit for employees to be able to not to resign, but to have an employer-initiated reduction of hours. So some employees might, sort of bottle it all up and not talk about it and then say, I need to resign. But if the employer were having a communication with them and say, okay, so temporarily, this is what it's going to look like. We need to reduce your hours. That could potentially allow for unemployment, but also for now for a COBRA subsidy. Next slide. So my final slide is to talk about what the American Rescue Plan Act did with regard to COBRA. So COBRA is the healthcare continuation law, and under ARPA, the employees who are involuntarily terminated or who have a reduction in their hours now are entitled to have their COBRA premiums paid by the employer from April 1st through September 30th of 2021. 100% COBRA subsidy, including whatever administrative fee would be charged. The employer can take a dollar for dollar tax credit for those amounts. This is for premiums for group health coverage, but it's importantly, also for people who already left but still are eligible for COBRA, still within that 18-month period or haven't gotten a new job with benefits. So there are definitely still some important things that employers and the government can be doing to help employees who do actually have to leave. So with that, I'm going to end. I know we probably have some great questions. This is a tough topic, and I thank you for your attention.
Karen, thank you so much. And please, everybody else, come on back too, and we'll take a little time here to dive into some questions. And well, welcome. Amazing amount of information that you guys presented in a short amount of time. So there's a lot to digest there. I'd suggest the audience, if you have any questions, please go ahead and send those in at this time. And but I'll jump in with one. And also, if this raised any questions for each other, also feel free. Don't wait for me to ask the question. Feel free to jump in yourselves. But I was wondering, based on some of the things that Karen, you were just describing in terms of things that employers can do voluntarily once the temporary laws expire, are those things that you all feel like are things that might be not only the right thing to do, but of competitive value to an employer who right now is potentially struggling with a really competitive hiring workspace? And are you seeing this happen? Are employers beginning to promote their own attention to this issue, in part to stay competitive? And anybody can feel free to jump in.
I will say yes, I've seen it. I mean, I have seen it, and I have seen companies focused on it. I have seen companies, some of the laws in New Hampshire, for example, well, the universal business guidelines that are in effect in New Hampshire, there were requirements that employers amend their policies to make sure that there were good sick leave. There was a explanation of what the sick leave policies were and those sorts of things. So I see this as a really good jumping off point for a lot of employers. And I think they see this could happen again and we need to be ready for it. But I absolutely think about the recruitment and retention aspect of this is huge. And I definitely have seen this. And I will also say, having the perspective of both being in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, I have seen a year and a half of run up for the Massachusetts employers to have a new paid family medical leave program. And then it happened on January 1st. And we were all going, oh my gosh, we still have the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And now we're also going to have this paid family medical leave act. How are employers going to deal with all this? Employees can be absent for 26 weeks. How can we manage to keep our business going? And I honestly haven't seen much of an impact from my clients. They are able to manage this and keep their employees without a huge amount of impact that at least I've seen.
Karen, why do you think that is? Like what are some of the factors that are driving that?
It's possible that people are not taking it as much because they've been allowed to work from home. It's possible that employers have seen what they can get by with over the past year. Or it's just that it hasn't risen to litigation and I haven't seen it yet. And that's the cynical view.
Switching gears a little bit, Melanie, how, based on your presentation and on your experience, in leadership, in civic leadership, how much of the solution for this issue is a legislative one and how much of it is a business-driven business policy one?
Well, that's a good question because we are hearing about many businesses that are implementing these policies. And many times that's where it starts, is for businesses to be role model. And I commend both Karen and Caitlin and your businesses. So we can look to the businesses for these best practices. And I know legislatively we have tried to pass paid family medical leave, and it's something that we will still continue to work on. But the more companies that adopt it, the more viable this idea is to bring forth with legislation as well.
Okay, and Caitlin, one of the things that you had mentioned in our presentation discussions was maybe a little bit of a silver lining here. You know, how many of these things would have happened if it hadn't been for the pandemic? I guess not that the pandemic was a good thing, but some of the issues that it brought to the fore, and then some of the responses that people had. And you had mentioned you'd seen examples of that firsthand, including both work policy ones, but also sort of cultural ones. And I think you mentioned having kids in the background as an example.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. You know, one of the things that's been really striking to me as a mom and just having colleagues who are mothers themselves is that, you know, pre-pandemic, if you were working from home or if someone was working from home, it would be like, you know, you would make sure no one would ever see your child in the background or even your dog or your cat. You know, you would try to make it look as professional as possible. And of course you still do, but I just think from a cultural standpoint, you know, employers are more understanding that people are doing their best. And, you know, if you hear a baby crying in the background or a toddler running around, you know, people kind of laugh it off and move on. And I think that, you know, that's been an advantage for moms that I think hasn't been there in the past, that you don't have to kind of hide that part of yourself at work. Because, you know, the work and home life have really consolidated, right? People are working out of their homes. And so, you know, your work bleeds into the evening and sometimes your life bleeds into the daytime. And so I think that has been one positive that's come out of all this.
Melanie or Karen, have you seen that play out in your own lives and business experiences as well?
I've actually worked from home for about 20 years, and I'm extremely productive and also have time for my family as well. One of the downsides is that sometimes you're working than you should be. You have to know when to shut it off. But it's been a huge help for me to maintain my family, my volunteering, the other work that I do, to have the ability to work from home.
Are there thoughts that you have I mean, you have that much experience working from home, you must have a good sense of how to not only deal with yourself when you're working from home, but to deal with other people and in terms of people who may have responsibilities to you from other remote locations and things. Some of the issues that Karen brought up, I think, in terms of productivity, accountability, all of those kind of things. Have you seen that evolve as people really sort of dive into working from home over the past year in terms of how you manage that? And do you have recommendations?
Well, I think that Karen was absolutely right about setting goals and accountability. So you have to ensure that you are meeting those goals, that you're showing that you are productive, and not being uptight when your child or your cat, for example, comes across the screen. I mean, we are doing our very best, and I think maintaining those workers in the workforce is really critical. So my advice is to employers, for example, to find where your employees can work from home and have that flexibility, and then be able to set up accountability steps and measures. Also checking in with each other periodically, having weekly meetings, setting those goals is an important step as well.
Yeah. Now, something else, Melanie, that you had mentioned in the beginning of your presentation was that women represent 2/3 of the essential worker population. And that dovetails with a question an audience member just wrote in, which is working from home is not always available. And I would imagine, especially for essential workers, how do employers and employees cope with work that can't be accomplished from home?
Well, that's a good point. It is not always an option, but there are flexibility options. There are options for, you know, as we talked about, paid family medical leave, setting up childcare or giving more insight to other groups that have childcare, even sharing with your neighbors childcare. We just have to be more creative and open-minded as we think about how to be versatile, how to incorporate that flexibility.
Childcare came up a number of times throughout this, and it seems like it's got to be really at the heart of things. What, or at least partly, what are some of the ways that companies are being creative around childcare right now that you guys are seeing out there?
I think one of the ways is expanding backup childcare options, so for companies that may have had a specific process where they use one company for backup options, opening that up to be a daily allowance during this time of crisis and letting people even use, pay, relatives or family members with that dollar allowance because that might be all that's available to them. I also think a lot of this comes down to manager sensitivity and manager training around, a lot of the impact in someone's day-to-day work life is what their manager says to them, the comments that they make or don't make, and kind of that reassurance that, you're doing your best. And if you have a good employee, just sticking by them through difficult times like this and knowing that it will pay off for you and for your team over the long term.
You mentioned backup childcare options. Can you describe that a little bit more as a policy?
Sure. So, a lot of times people have either a daycare or a nanny that they use on a day-to-day basis. And even during, quote unquote, normal times, non-COVID times, that childcare provider could be sick, or your child might not be able to go to daycare because they're sick, or the daycare is closed for some reason. And so employers will often make a backup benefit available where they give employees a certain dollar amount or a facility that they could use in those circumstances. And so what I'm referring to during this time is just being more flexible about what those options might be, since that one particular center that's typically covered might not be an option, or a parent might not feel safe with that option during this time.
Are at least with maybe larger companies, are any actually providing childcare on site?
I have heard of that happening in some cases, where it's feasible and where they've been able to remain open during this time.
I will also say one of the looking over some bills that are pending in New Hampshire over the past week. One of them is a bill to put together a committee to study whether employers should be giving tax credits, or a program under which employers would give tax credits to in exchange for providing employees with stipends for childcare. So there's a possibility that if that is studied, whether there's some sort of additional employer benefit that could be offset against their payroll taxes. So again, as Melanie said, being as creative as possible with where can we get resources for this? Where can we get employer buy-in for this? What do employees actually need? What can work is I think a really important step forward.
Thank you. And so we are very near the top of the hour. I want to mention we had a question come in as far as will the presentation be available. We will be sending this out to everybody who registered, so you will be able to get a copy of the presentation. We also wanted to take a minute and have each one of you, leave us with your best next steps. If you're speaking directly to a lot of employers right now, what your recommendations are, your best practice, your number one takeaway from either the material that you presented today or just in general on this topic. And maybe we could start with Melanie.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful hour. Talked with great information, very important information. I would say that we can look to other companies who have done these things successfully. That's really important. And also that retaining good workers and women, 2/3 of the essential workforce, women are very good workers. We need to retain them. We need to work towards pay equity and have solutions to keep them in the workforce and also raise their level within jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen.
So I'll just say over the past year, we have talked to hundreds of employers. And the question is, what is legal to do versus what is, or in addition to, what is the right thing to do? And so we can certainly provide a lot of advice about what the laws allow and require, but it comes down to what the employee needs and what the employer, the culture that the employer wants to have. And we are, we can give those legal guidelines, but really just encourage employers, look at what your policies are, look at what your handbooks say, look at what the laws require, and then see, are you willing to take that extra step to keep very valuable talent under your roof?
Thank you. And Caitlin.
Thanks, Ernesto. Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is to keep having this conversation, talking to your colleagues, keeping this dialogue going within your organization. The problem's not going to change, right? We're in this for a while with this COVID situation, unfortunately. And even post that, we had a problem even pre-pandemic with equal opportunities for women. And so, I think if you really want to be part of the solution, it's a matter of continuing that dialogue, recognizing the problem, and finding the areas where you can provide flexibility and really enhance your benefits to be meaningful for women within your population.
Thank you so much. And on that note, we will call it a day and really hopefully just the beginning of a much broader conversation. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's session. We're sponsored by Sheehan Phinney, United Healthcare, and Tufts Health Freedom Plan. Recording of today's presentation will be available at nhbr.com shortly. Thank you all again. And thank you, Emily Samadas, our producer, who keeps this whole thing running on time and in order. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.